Good evening, everyone. My name is John Taves, and I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is located here in Treaty 1 territory. That is, of course, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Inanimate, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Dene people, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, of course, McNally Robinson itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. I am delighted that you could all join us here, both in person and virtually, as we celebrate the Winnipeg launch of the latest collection of poetry from Rhea Tregebov. I'm so happy to have Rhea back here. We've had her here for novels in the past, but I am quite a fan of her poetry myself, so I'm delighted that we're able to be here and gathered to celebrate her latest collection, Talking to Strangers, published by Véhicule Press. A copy of which I would traditionally hold up if I didn't have it buried beneath my speech. I won't take up too much of your time right now because I do have the incredible pleasure of introducing our host for this evening, and it is an embarrassment of riches tonight, poetic ones in particular. But before we do, just a quick rundown on how the evening will go. There'll be an introduction and then a reading by Rhea from just behind this podium, and we'll then move on to a conversation with her and Sarah Enns. Following that, there will be an opportunity for you and the audience to ask questions. So if you're located here physically, please just put up your hand and I will run over to you in a non-threatening way with this microphone. It's not because we don't believe you can project, it is just to ensure that those watching at home can hear your question. And if you are one of those people watching on YouTube, feel free to type either your question or any positive words of support you might have into the chat. We will ask the questions to the author, or put the questions to the author, and of course, pass along all your positive words. Following the event, we will move along to the signing, so please stand by for some exciting signing procedure from me after closing. We'd also like to express our gratitude to the League of Canadian Poets for helping to support this evening as well. They are an organization that provides so much incredible support to poets across the country, and we're delighted to have them involved in this event. Now, your host, Sarah Enns, is a writer and editor based in Treaty 1 territory. She is the author of 2 books of poetry, both published by Turnstone Press, and both shortlisted for the McNally Robinson Book of the Year Award. Her book, Fly Away, won the Relit Award in 2023. Sarah is the Manitoba and Saskatchewan representative for the Writers Union of Canada and a tremendous poet. It gives me great pleasure to ask you to join me in welcoming Sarah Enns.
Thanks so much, John, and thank you, McNally, and thank you to Rhea for inviting me to be part of this evening. It is my very great privilege to introduce Rhea Tregebov and her wonderful new book, Talking to Strangers, to you tonight. Rhea is the author of now 8 critically acclaimed collections of poetry. Her poems have earned the Pat Lowther Award, the Prairie Schooner Reader's Choice Award, and the Malahat Review's Long Poem Award. Rhea also writes fiction, and her novels have won the Nancy Richler Memorial Prize for Fiction and the J.I. Siegel Award. She has also published 5 popular children's picture books and has edited numerous anthologies. Rhea was born in Saskatoon and was raised in Winnipeg, and I'm always very thrilled when she comes back home to McNally for book launches. She studied at the U of M, Cornell, Boston University. She worked in Toronto for a while as a freelance writer and editor, and then she taught at the School of Creative Writing at the University of British Columbia, where I was lucky enough to study poetry from her during my BFA. I have learned so much from Rhea about how to be a writer and a poet from her classes, which I cherished and still think of often when I'm working on a poem, but also from her brilliant books and from the way that she lives her life. Rhea is a generous and passionate advocate of other writers. She was the chair of the Writers Union of Canada from 2021 to 2023, and she is especially a cheerleader for emerging poets, and I'm so personally grateful for that. Talking to Strangers is a masterfully crafted collection about encounter and witness loss, and connection, and I am very much looking forward to hearing Rhea read from it. Please give a warm welcome to Rhea Tregebov.
Go. How's that? How's the mic? Well, I see that my mother still draws a wonderful crowd, so thank you. It is so good to be here. I want to thank John and McNally Robinson for having this launch. I have launched every book I've written at McNally Robinson. I think I was my first book of poetry, which was my first book, was I think their first reading. So it's a long history that I very much treasure. And we're coming up on Independent Bookstore Day in 2 days. 2 days. And they make such a difference, and especially a bookstore like McNally Robinson, which does so much for its community. So I'm very grateful, and I'm very happy to be here today. And thanks to Sarah, when we were discussing the protocol for the reading, I said, well, I don't want to be standing up there when you're saying nice things about me, because I would be beet red. So I'm glad I was seated while she was introducing me. That's beautiful. And as you can imagine, anyone who knows Sarah knows her work. She was a remarkable student, and I loved working with her. It was a real privilege, that job. It was tremendous. So Sarah and I have been back and forth a little bit about which poems to read, and I hope that I've come up with ones that work for our discussion, which will follow. I really have read very little from this book. You know, normally when you're in the midst of working on a project, you go to little evenings and you're invited here and there, but of course, much of the book was written during the pandemic. And so I haven't had that audience. We had a launch in Vancouver just last week, and the work feels more alive when you read it to an audience and you hear both what's working and what isn't working in it. So I'm very, very grateful to be here. I wanted to start with a Sarah request. It's a poem near the beginning of the book, and it's called The End of Everything. And there's a double entendre, both how things end and what their purpose is in the use of that word. So, and this first section of the book is derived from poems that are sort of external sources. So reading a newspaper article or listening to a program on the radio. And in this case, I'm unsurprisingly, I'm an English major, but I do have like a interest in science in my life right now. I'm surrounded by real scientists. And so I love Quirks and Quarks, the CBC radio program that's been on for ages. And this was, in fact, an episode of Quirks and Quarks, and it's I'm just looking at the notes here. It was an interview with the astronomer Katie Mack about her book, which is called The End of Everything, Astrophysically Speaking. The end of everything. Cosmology knows everything began. Remember the Big Bang? And will end. Stars form, die, galaxies morph. The universe won't stay. The astrophysicist figures we have 5 paths: heat death, big crunch, big rip, vacuum decay, or my personal favorite, bouncing cosmologies. Contrary to popular opinion, heat death is in fact the death of heat, not death by heat. This big chill is the most likely suspect. For the big crunch, picture a classic house of cards, twin towers pancaking. Everything we can imagine and all we can't folding inwards into itself. The big rip is plain rage, dark energy, which we don't understand, at war with the stuff we do. Stars torn from galaxies, poor stars. Planets, poor planets, torn from their stars till everyone is alone in their own dimming little pool of light. Vacuum decay has the universe shudder, succumb to a basic instability, giving in to some core flaw. I do like the unlikely bouncing cosmologies, where everything pinballs, beginning and ending, cycling over and over and over again. Some comfort there. When the astrophysicist is asked what this has to do with us, she says we are irrelevant, inconsequential, perfectly insignificant. So what do we have to do with this if we don't matter? What is the end of everything? In particular, us. Maybe this. Maybe for us, this. Everything may be one countenance, one single look, or in these days of pestilence, touch. Someone we know like the back of our hand, that's someone touching our hand. These are days of pestilence, days of excess deaths. Every day, each death, a death too many. Each death, the end of a world. So that was composed in the middle of the pandemic. And then there's a section in the middle of the book that is called Talking to Strangers, and it's actually nonfiction. It's about encounters that I wound up having. It actually, every poem is the location and the date is indicated. So it started before the pandemic and continued through it, and I don't know that we're past it, but to current times. And there's 10 of them, and it's about these encounters where you suddenly have an intimate conversation with someone that you don't know at all, or someone that you don't know as well as you think you do. And I chose this one among them because it's set in Winnipeg, and the date is August 2020. It's called Talk, Scrap. Across the kitchen table, my cousin, whose life at a distance seemed to contain extravagances, white couches, white pooches, white rugs, tells me she doesn't want to waste. I've witnessed her cakes with their delectable flourishes, her T-bones broiled medium rare, dessert aperitif confections. But now she wants to use all her odds and sods, orts, every scrap, the tan bones of chicken carcass, honey-colored onion skins, freckled potato peels, curls of carrot parings, ferny fronds of carrot tops, pale green celery stalk furls, things I throw into a bucket to rot. She has a diagnosis, doesn't talk prognosis. She's making stock. Frozen it keeps for months. She's thinking past this fall into winter, its short days, taking stock. And I'll just read 2 more poems. These actually are all Sarah requests. And this is from the section really with I think of them as love poems. And this one is called How It Works. Though I don't know how planes work, I fly. This miracle, a thing we've made. Trust is necessary or we crash. I thought love was a thing, some thing I could touch with my hands, like a chair or a table, my sister's knuckle, husband's wrist, a miracle. But nothing is a thing, not things, not thought. Everything is motion, backwards or forwards, crashing, recombining. My husband's body beside someone else's now, sisters in earth. I also lie beside another body, beside a mind I can't touch, one that knows process, being, subatomic bits of matter that understands how things work. I want to say to this man, let your body trust me. Tell me about your loneliness, about the boy you failed to describe. Boy alone in the kitchen, spooning beans from a can to his wanting mouth, hungering. Tell me why you're bereft if I turn from your body in the night. And yet you want your loneliness untended, preserved. Trust, you say, is dangerous. We know what people do. But we don't need love to be a thing we can put our hands on to trust. Trust me, you. Believe that we know the miracle, how it works. And then one last poem. I've just been reading Michael Ondaatje's new book, A Year of Last Things, and there's a poem in there called Definition, which is really wonderful. And so in that shadow, this poem is also called Definition. In it, I talk about the cold place I grew up in, and of course that cold place is Winnipeg. Though I was born in Saskatoon, we moved here before I turned 3. Now I'm living in Vancouver, where we have a long growing season and almost everything can grow. You can grow figs in Vancouver. And I do have this big unruly garden there that I've just been mucking. It's been warm enough. I've just gotten into it. And I describe here a war against buttercups, but now it's a war against anemones, which, you wouldn't think they look like the prettiest little thing, but they're like insane. Like they were choking the rhubarb. Like nobody chokes my rhubarb. So this is called Definition. I describe my woes to my friend, the pro, genius of a plot greater and finer than my own big old garden, where everything grows into everything else. Definition, she tells me. That's what I need. I was defined by a cold place, a time when summer was brief and brilliant, by a house of enough in a neighborhood of just and not enough, pink petunias and orange marigold, a red rose or 2. But here, too much. Too much moneywort invaded by stone crop, inveigled by barren wort, entangled with leopard's bane. Besotted, greedy, jealous to save every bloom, leave for me this more than enough isn't too much. Can't yank a stem I call flower, not weed. Though there is the buttercup war I keep waging, kneeling on stones like a penitent, cursing their stubborn, fecund being. But what's the difference between flowers and weeds? Peter, at 8, enlisted as a foot soldier, asks. Pull everything up and what comes back is weed, my dad in his heyday when kid. Neatly defining invasive. Define need. Define enough. My friend tells me I need to learn to say no to ferns sprouting in the daylilies, to sweet woodruff infiltrating hosta. Need to define what it is I want, what I keep, love, let flourish. I want too much. Thank you. How's that? The mics, if people at the back are clear? Thanks. I'm getting thumbs up.
Well, thanks, Rhea, for reading those poems. They were some of my favorites, so
Thank you.
I'm glad to hear them read. I thought maybe it would be good to start talking about the title of this book and that central sequence, which is a series of vignettes of encounters with strangers. And when I was reading that, I was curious about, what draws you to the idea of a stranger? Why was that such fertile ground for this book?
Thanks for asking. It started, the very first poem in the series was written in 2011, so it didn't quite make it into the last, or it was begun in 2011. And at the time, I didn't realize it was going to be a series. I just had this encounter with a woman in Whitehorse in the middle of June. So at midnight, it was daylight. And got this very surprisingly intimate response. And then sort of another poem with another stranger. And I am the kind of chatty Winnipeg person that talks to people when, that is quite open that smiles at strangers and talk. In Winnipeg, I think you're considered rude if you don't talk to the person who's sitting next to you on the bus, whereas in Vancouver, you'd be like drummed off the bus. So I do find these encounters interesting, and I started to witness a pattern there. And when I've talked about this with friends, they talk about how, in a way, you can risk more with a complete stranger, especially if the encounter is limited, right? You're walking down the beach and you're going to go in your different directions. So there's kind of a safety, but there's also a kind of risk, and I really. So I didn't look for any of these. They were all biographical, and they were all kind of happenstance. And some that I encounters that I had just couldn't turn into poems. They're just either I wasn't up to it or there wasn't enough there. But I really, especially as the pandemic, at the worst of the pandemic, when our only encounters with people were standing 6 feet away from each other, waiting to get into the supermarket, or it seems so poignant. And it's become a very interesting sociological moment. It's come to be of greater sociological interest, these what they call weak social connections. And they talk about how they enrich your life. And when we lost so many of that during the contactless world, you didn't go to the supermarket necessarily, you had stuff delivered, or you were, or we went and picked stuff up, and you don't chat with the checkout clerk who you kind of know, you don't, and you don't sit down for a cup of coffee. And so the poverty of that really struck me. So I think I got more and more interested in it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Well, I was really struck by that series, how they sort of begin, you don't know, like you didn't when you went into that encounter, you don't know where they're going to go, and there's kind of this distilling or this moment of clarity or really openness and intimacy that feels unexpected every time. But it is kind of amazing, you're right, how there's something about talking to someone you'll only see one time that does kind of allow sometimes maybe for that openness. I was thinking too, when you were talking about safety and risk, in the poem that you read, How It Works, there's the line, I wrote it down here. Trust, you say, is dangerous. We know what people do. And I thought that's a thread also in this book, and how I'm curious about how you negotiated that encountering the other, and trying to remain open to connection, but also, being aware that there is some danger and risk in any kind of encounter like that.
Yeah, they're not all the encounters are as friendly. And there's one of me being really snippy, eavesdropping on a woman who I call an ancient hippie, and I'm being like super judgmental about it, which everybody knows me, I'm excellent at being super judgmental. And suddenly it turned like as I was eavesdropping on the conversation, and so I let that happen. And there's one very awful encounter outside of a hospital where this was in February 2022 when the convoy was still on and masking was, and I had a really big man pretend to cough in my face, you know, and tell me I had COVID. And like an idiot, like I turned around and started to yell. I'm like, this is alpha classic Rhea. So that risk is there, right? You know, and then as the poem goes on, it is very small friend defended him, you know, or just protected him and protected me in that encounter. So I tried to include those elements of risk there as well. Yeah, and it was, you know, one of the funny things about writing poetry is you just sort of leap from one poem to the next. Like when you're working on a novel, it's sitting there waiting for you to work on it, like a little, you know, like a dog waiting for you to come home. It's like, oh, can we work on this chapter now? Whereas with a poem, you don't have that continuity and it can be disconcerting. So having a series like this was a comforting kind of thing to be writing.
Yeah, well, and I thought it posed some interesting ideas about what do we owe to each other in relationship and people we know well, and then what do we owe to each other in a more abstract way and to people that you only see one time, and that question, or the book is kind of grappling, I think, with that that question. I was there's another section in the collection which you didn't read from because well, one of them is my favorite, is the bitter poem. Oh. So you have this section called tastes, and you go through, there's a sweet, sour, the other ones.
Salt, bitter, and umami, the five.
Yeah, and I love how potent those those poems are, and I was curious about, you know, what about that particular sense, taste, compelled you to want to write about it, and how does that fit into the overall collection for you?
Yeah, as I was writing this book, so I started it about 5 years ago or so, there was a lot of losses in my life that then deepened, but I read a book by a poet that I really respect, and it was very focused on loss and grieving, and I just wanted this book to be different. I wanted it to be celebratory as well and to extend beyond the individual personal life. And so that was what seemed like fun about the taste poems, because it's kind of abstract, although there's little narratives in each of them, and tiny little, you know, crystal kind of poems. And so dealing with a more abstract thing, like, I mean, taste is very visceral, but on the other hand, those definitions are kind of abstract. That appealed to me as well. It started with the bitter poem, with the marmalade poem. Yeah. And again, there's the comfort, you know, I'm confessing here, there's the comfort of having a series that keeps you writing when you're writing a book of poetry.
Yeah. Well, maybe we can talk a little bit about form. You know, you have these little poems, and then you have some prose poems, there's a villanelle, and then you have a series of the book ends with this really gorgeous section called Behold, a series of elegies. Really moving section, and in that section, maybe I'll quickly show, there are just sort of little wisps, I would say, of words on each page. And there was something about about the brevity of the words that I thought sort of was able to articulate an unspeakable, unbearable kind of loss, and also something about the directness, you know, of everything else that has been pared away, and what there is love, I think. And anyway, that section, I thought the form was just brilliant in terms of communicating that. And yeah, I wondered if you wanted to say something about the forms that show up in this book.
Well, again, with this book, I had a commitment not to, this is my 8th book and you were about just repeating yourself. So I did have a commitment to trying to be a little more experimental. And, there's some books where I sort of fell into the very long line, very long poems with complicated syntax, which apparently is like impossible to translate. I was working with translators at one point and they're like, we hate your syntax. Because if it gets very elaborate, you have no idea what's referring to what, but I kind of love that. I love when the readers just kind of sink into the syntax. But with this book, I wanted to try very different forms. And with the elegy, which is for my sister, who died very suddenly, with that, I felt muted, or not muted, I felt silenced. And so just like a couple little words would come out, and that seemed to be the only way of dealing with it. And I did get a really helpful edit from Carmen Starnino, the editor at Véhicule, who helped me. I had to put a little bit more in. And so that word seemed inadequate, so there's not that many.
Yeah. Well, it's beautiful. It's really amazing. Okay, I have 2 more thoughts of that, but because you read the end of everything. There's a lot of your poems have this kind of zooming in and zooming out motion that happens, or there's a sort of paying really careful, close attention to a small detail and then kind of zooming out to a bigger sort of all-encompassing statement, and then coming back in and this kind of, and anyway, I was just really drawn to that motion that you do so elegantly, and I don't know, is that something you're intentional about, that movement, or does it sort of just happen?
I think it's sort of news to me as you describe it, but I do think it comes from that desire not to have too narrow scope and not to have a single, I didn't want the book to have one note, just one thing that I was thinking about, because even though life can be full of loss and especially as you age, it's also full of brand new people. I'm looking at my great nephew and niece who are sitting here, as well as some other very young listeners. So so zooming out and zooming in, both to appreciate what's right there in front of you, but also to appreciate a larger context. So
I'm wondering if we should open it up for any questions that there might be from the audience.
Sure, yeah. And John said he'll run up with a mic if there are any questions.
So I'm kind of cheating because I've never actually asked you this question ever. I should have about 20 years ago. So Rhea, tell me about the process. How do you go from that moment of inspiration to actually being able to let go and be done with a poem? What is that? How does that work for you?
Well, this will be familiar to Sarah, who is my student, but revision is huge. Some poems come easier than others, and some come very hard, and like over and over, like many revisions. And I think that process is a process of really understanding what it is you're writing about. Most of the poems start with, a phrase, an image. Often the rhetorical stance is really important. I just had an idea for another poem. I didn't think I was writing another book, but maybe I am, poetry right now, where it was phrased, there's a story about borders. And I realized it had to be there's a story, not I have a story or I tell a story, that rhetorical structure, which sets up a relationship between the speaker and the subject and the audience, is super important. So often, like I'll just get a rhetorical structure or I'll get images, and it's really hard. I can't sort of sit down and go, I should write a poem about how brilliant my niece is. That's my niece, yes. But so these things occur to, you know, and where the inspiration comes in, I talk with my I used to talk with my students about being on the poetry train. You know, so like when you're writing, it's like, that's material, and that's material, and that's material. Everything feels like material. And then if that wanes and you're feeling dry, then you have to get back into something that suddenly everything is a poem. And for me, the best way of doing that is reading people that are really, really energizing, reading others' work. And so endless revision, sometimes putting it away in a drawer. And then if you're lucky, you have either friends who are good editors, you know, writer friends, which I am lucky to have. And then finally, I have the editor of the book. So he really improved that book. He booted out about 5 poems, and it was like, what's this poem doing here? You know? But he also did some really substantive editings that was extremely helpful, made it a much better book. Die.
Something I've always admired and loved and also feared in your writing is there's a sort of element of terror and sort of just willingness to go right up close to it. And it even seems to me it's a sort of it's been there from your first book, and here it still is. And that first poem you read tonight was just like, you know, that you're willing to just look really sort of like open-eyed at the most terrifying things. So can you talk a little bit about terror, the poetics of terror in your writing?
I'm a scaredy cat. I think agency within the world has always been challenging to me. I know lots of people for whom that is not at all the case, right? They want to go out there and the world is their oyster and they have plans and they do things, and somehow things have been much more frightening for me. And I mean, no, that I have gone out and done stuff. I haven't let that keep me from doing things I want to do, but those barriers have been there. And so I guess I gotta, because they're so high for me, I've got to either confront them or not write anything. Scary good questions, folks. Oh no, Warren. No, there's a super smart person.
I don't think we've ever talked about this, Rhea, but I know that you have done a lot of translation work and you've taught translation, I think, at UC as well. I'm wondering whether translation has affected how you write your poetry, or how being a translator may influence your poetry.
Oh, cool. The translation has really been a sideline compared to people who, you know, are really great at it. And most of my translations have been tandem. So I've helped translate Finnish poetry without knowing a word of Finnish. You work with the bilingual Finnish person who's not a poet and for whom English isn't a first language, and she presents you with the draft and then you talk about it. I mean, I think I do just love words, and when you're in between languages, like when you're translating, you fall in that gap between languages. You fall in that gap between languages. It gives you a really sort of elemental experience of language that way. So I think it's allowed me to indulge that thrill. And reading in other languages, I do a limited amount, but when I am translating, it really invigorates your own language, right? You can't take English for granted as the only way of understanding and seeing the world. And for unilingual people, you do, right? And so I love that feeling of pushing at the edges of what is sayable in English versus what is sayable in other languages. The whole the whole sociolinguistic thing. It's so fascinating to me. We can go. I'm scared. This is such a smart omen. Let's get off these stools quick.
I'm wondering if maybe we can ask you to read one more
Sure.
to close out.
Question here.
Oh, there is a question. Thanks,
I'll-
Richard.
I'll-
Yeah. I thought I snuck away.
Well, I feel like you might have answered already, but I prepared it in my mind, so I am grateful to you because pre-COVID, everything's pre or post-COVID, you were here in the cafe with my book club and we discussed The Knife Sharpener's Bell. And that was really special for us.
Yeah.
And I was thinking of a couple things. I was thinking of another author that came to our book club, Margaret Sweatman. And I was in line with her at the bookstore to buy her tea, and she just started asking questions in a way that the curiosity about me that I wasn't used to. People usually are not that, they don't really want to know about your trip. They don't really want to know about what you do, right? And that really stood with me. And then I was also thinking about the writers for Seinfeld. And I heard that a writer will be in the middle of a big fight with their spouse and they'll get a twinkle in their eye and the wife will go, "Don't you dare." And all of a sudden he's like, "Oh, this will be a good episode," right? And so I was just wondering if that's if you have this curiosity of everything, you walk around or if it's just moments where you have that, you're gathering ideas. So I know you spoke to that already and you've talked about authors also impacting, but I don't know if you want to say anything else about that.
Yeah, I do find people interesting. I think I'm sometimes, impatient or judgmental for sure, so I know I've had other writers visit. I have been able to observe them in workshops and see their genuine interest in the students, and as you said, tell me about your summer vacation, and really caring in a wonderful way. And I'm not that patient. I care very much about my students' lives, but I can be like, that's not interesting, or don't you realize how privileged you are that so I think I'm somewhere in between. Not very nice.
Did you stand
I'd rather die.
I'm thinking about, what about Singing Away the Bears?
Oh, okay.
I'm thinking about it because of the way it ends. And thinking about poetics of terror and of being open to the world.
Okay. All right. So this is set in, when I moved to Vancouver, I wound up doing a lot more hiking than I did in Toronto, where I used to live. And people take bear bells, and the other thing that you're supposed to do when you're on these hikes is you can sing or talk, and that will keep the bears away. It's called Singing Away the Bears. You're ahead of me on the trail. You don't talk. Don't mind the singing. I know I don't measure up to the woman you'd want. Quick, brave. The bears are real, even when they're not near, even when they are neither. With or without you, I do this. Raise my voice, lift it through fear. John's going to tell us what to do.
Yes, indeed, I will emerge from that cave. Thank you so very much for the conversation, and what a wonderful final reading. Thank you, Rhea. We will be moving along to the signing portion of the evening right now, which will conveniently take place immediately to my right. So we will move Rhea a few meters over here, where you will be able to descend and have copies of her latest Talking to Strangers signed. Please do feel free to get a book signed before you pay for it at the cash desk. Just please do remember to pay for the book at some point tonight. We're so very grateful to the League of Canadian Poets for helping to put this event on. Also so very grateful to Véhicule Press, of course, without whom there would be no book to celebrate tonight. Thank you all for being here, for your attention, for your questions, and for the conversation both before and invariably after this event. I will ask you to join me in 2 rounds of applause right now. The first is, of course, for our incredible host, Sarah Enns. And the second to once again celebrate Rhea Tregebov. So much, Rhea, and thank you all for coming. Have a wonderful evening.